and welcome Ehsaneh to the next stage. So when you and I talked about me being one of the pre-readers for your book, and I read it and I started talking to you more about it, I realized the next stage would be a great fit, a great time for you to promote your book. So I'm so excited it worked out. And for those of you that haven't read it or seen it, door between us. So for those of you that are new or maybe know Ehsaneh but don't know a lot about her background, she is an Iranian-American novelist and activist with a Ph.D. in international relations. She has worked in various capacities on campaigns related to Palestinian human rights, Iranian sanctions, access to credit for rural villagers, and safe spaces for children in crisis. She currently works with the Silicon Valley Bicycle Coalition to create the culture and infrastructure changes needed to support a shift away from carbon-based modes of transportation. Ehsaneh and her 5 brothers grew up in Tehran, Salt Lake City, and a Maryland suburb of DC, with a Mormon-American mother and a Muslim Iranian father who kept the family active in both religious communities. In her early 20s, Ehsaneh moved to Iran to work on urban and rural poverty alleviation efforts with local NGOs, as well as the Islamic Republic of Iran's Ministry of Reconstruction Jihad. Ehsaneh lives now in Northern California, as most of us here now, with her husband and 2 children. So welcome.
It's so great to be here. Thank you so much for thinking of connecting me with the next stage. And Marina, this has been just so exciting. And I just, love the work of City Lights Theater and the way that you guys create space for the arts and theater in San Jose. So it was just so exciting to be connected in this way.
So we know each other from our teenagers now, almost 16-year-olds, right? Discovery Charter School. And we had a few short conversations over the years, but it was, Discovery is a community where you see parents on campus and you say hi. And so it's been really great as we've gotten to know each other over the past few months. And then, like you said, we'll be taking questions at the end. But for now, Ehsaneh, how would you like to start? Would you like, I believe you have a presentation for us. Would you like to start with that?
Yeah, I can jump right into that. So why don't we do that? And then we'll do questions, but please feel free as we're going through this. If you have questions, just drop them in the chat and then we'll be attending to those near the end. So I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Let's see if this will work. All right. And if you're only seeing it really small, what you might want to do is just adjust your settings. So you're looking at it at speaker view, and then that should make it a little bit bigger for you. Okay. So what I'm going to be talking about is kind of 2 things. I want to give you a little bit of a background about myself and my connection to Iran. A lot of you know pieces of it, but this will give kind of a little bit more of an overview. And then I'm going to go from there into a little of the historical context of what was going on in Iran in 2009, which is when the book takes place. So you'll have a sense of kind of that context. So what I have here is kind of it's Iran in 1979, 1999, and 2009. Okay, so my beautiful parents who are here tonight as well. So they met when they were students in California, and politics was a part of their life really from the beginning. They were really involved in the student movement against the Iranian king, which many of you know was the Shah at the time. And even as the family grew, so here's some fun pictures. I don't know if my parents knew that there were gonna be so many pictures of them, so surprise. My parents were still really closely following everything that was going on in Iran as protests were heating up in the late 70s. And just shortly after this last picture was taken, my father kind of couldn't take it anymore, being away from his family, his brothers, his friends, other people who were risking so much out in the streets to overthrow the Shah. So my parents decided that my mom and us 3 kids at the time were going to stay here while he flew to Iran with the idea that we would be joining him once things kind of settled down. So that's what he did. And he was in Iran for a lot of the really seminal events of 1979. This is when the Shah finally left. He was then replaced by Khomeini, and this hope around what was supposed to be this new and democratic regime. And then shortly after, we did join him in Tehran. This is a quote from my mom when we were talking about this recently. She said, "I was really excited to be in Iran. I felt I was having an experience similar to our founding fathers as they broke away from Britain to establish their own democratic experience." I've heard a lot about how that early post-revolutionary period and just kind of the sense of community that was there, and the sense, wow, we accomplished this amazing thing, which made it even harder and more heartbreaking when that democratic experiment went awry. By the time I was going into 3rd grade, my parents had kind of realized that they no longer felt safe. A number of friends and family had gotten into trouble with the regime, had left, had been jailed. We were lucky and able to get out, and then we moved to be with my grandparents in Salt Lake City. Once we were in Salt Lake and then later in the DC area, it didn't feel safe for a long time to go back to Iran, but by the time I finished my undergrad degree and was kind of looking for adventure and a way to serve a little bit, things had settled down, and I did move to Iran. So this is me with my beautiful cousin and her family in Iran that I lived with when I was in Tehran. Sadly, my cousin was on the flight that was recently shot down in Tehran, which is why I'm stopping here a little bit, getting a little emotional seeing her. While I was in Iran, among other things, I worked with the Ministry of Jihad Against Poverty, or Reconstruction Jihad, with colleagues that were working on expanding economic opportunity and access in the villages. On the left, you can see the ministry building in Tehran, and those are some pictures in the work that we were doing in the villages. Let's see. Oops. Okay. So most of my Iranian family wasn't necessarily super religious, and they definitely weren't regime supporters, but many of my work colleagues were. And it was a really fascinating experience kind of having these conversations around what does it mean to be a supporter of the regime, and how does one sort of justify some of the uglier aspects of the regime, or how do people's thinking kind of evolve over time. And then, as it turned out, I ended up meeting and marrying someone whose family was not only super conservative, not only supported the regime, but had people who had held numerous senior positions within the government. So that was a whole new level of discussion and conversation, and then also experiences as I got to be a part of this new family life that in some ways maybe felt different, but in other ways was still very similar to family life in Salt Lake City. So these were some of the experiences and individuals and conversations and things that I drew on as I was thinking about the characters in my book and the conflicts and thoughts and ideas that they might have as they were going through the 2009 experience. So now we come to 2009. So what's interesting actually is in some ways, the 2009 election was kind of similar to our current election. You had an incumbent, Ahmadinejad, on the right. He was running against a challenger, Mousavi, on the left. Ahmadinejad was definitely the regime favored candidate. And interestingly, he was really one of these kind of talk off the cuff people who would say these kind of outrageous things, didn't necessarily care who he offended. Mousavi was kind of this elder statesman who was seen by many as favoring more liberal, more democratic principles. One of the things that was also unusual about Mousavi was the extent to which his wife, Zahra Rahnavard, she's in the picture with him, she's an artist, but also has this very public persona and was very involved in the campaign with him, which was definitely unusual. So we were not in Iran in 2000, we weren't living there any longer, but we visited actually this is a picture just a couple months before the revolution or the election. This is me and the kids with my in-laws. And you could see that the Mousavi campaign had really generated a lot of enthusiasm and excitement. You'd see folks gathering, sometimes spontaneously, to kind of shout slogans in favor of Mousavi or against Ahmadinejad. The campaign had adopted the color green, so you'd see these green balloons and green banners everywhere. on election day, we were back in the States and we were kind of watching nervously, closely. And one thing that was really exciting was to see this huge turnout. So these are pictures of people who were standing in line for hours and hours. And this seemed to really bode well for a Mousavi victory. So it was a really big shock that night, right after the polls closed, when state television announced that Ahmadinejad had won. And then when Mousavi did not accept these results and said that the people's vote must be defended, people poured out into the streets that weekend. So over the next few days, you had millions of Tehranis out, or not just Tehranis, Iranians coming out from all over the country, but particularly in Tehran. And that green color that was part of Mousavi's campaign had now become the color of protest. And this is where the green movement was born. There's the green fabric that's kind of draping over the cover of my book. And it was inspired by all the banners and scarves and other things that people were using during that time. Unfortunately, it wasn't long before the government cracked down on the protesters in a really scary way. And Tehran sort of turned into a battlefield. And one of the things that was interesting to me during this time in talking to friends and family in Iran was, I couldn't necessarily predict who was going to be in favor of the protests and who was convinced that this was kind of, either that the protesters had gone too far and they needed to be reined in, we needed law and order, or that it really was some sort of plot by Western powers to overthrow the government. So those conversations were just interesting to hear. It didn't necessarily track with what I would have expected. And for the book, I was really interested in capturing this moment in time and kind of exploring this experience through the eyes of families and characters that in the West, we just don't get to necessarily connect with and see that often. So this is the context of the book what was going on when the book opens. And it opens on the scene of a wedding between Sarah and Ali. And the wedding has been arranged, but as they're getting close to the wedding, the bride and groom have fallen in love, through the course of the engagement, have gotten to know each other. But the families have now had a disagreement because they're on different sides of this political divide. And so they don't want this wedding to go through anymore. So we've got all this family tension where the family's trying to pull the couple apart. And then in addition, Sarah and Ali get dragged into what's going on in the streets when on their wedding night, they make the fateful decision to allow one of the protesters into their car and try to hide them from one of the Basiji militiamen who is coming after her. So that is kind of the setup for the story, and I will stop there.
That was fantastic. Thank you for sharing that with us. Yeah. I was thinking about your bio and what you shared, and I'm wondering, you said you moved back to Iran when you finished your undergraduate degree. And do you think that move, tell me what you experienced there and how that helped inform, aside from your visits with family, how that helped inform you as you wrote this book and what you experienced when you were in Iran in your early 20s.
Yeah, that was a really exciting, I didn't necessarily know what I was in for. As a young person, I was kind of excited by the idea of adventure and, connection kind of with my dad's country again. And, my Farsi wasn't too bad, but, kind of really strengthening it so it wouldn't be so rusty. But, I was thinking of maybe I'd join the Peace Corps, and my dad was like, you should really think about going to Iran. So, and I think moving there initially, it's like anytime you make a big move, at first everything seems really strange and, weird and hard. And, for me, one of the big learning curves was hopping the shared taxis. So you have to figure out, where do you stand to hop in the right taxi? And then you have to figure out, okay, where do you hop out again to get on the next leg? Because that taxi is not taking you necessarily to your destination, just to a piece of it, and you have to know. And all the while you have to make sure you're avoiding, because in Iran, you can't just go to a bar to meet someone. So there's a certain amount of guys just cruising around and picking people, hot, so you need to make sure that you're getting in the car of an actual taxi and not someone who's looking for a conversation or whatever. So just that piece alone, navigating that was a learning curve. But then, you know, after you've been in a new place, and, you know, it's like you move to New York and you're learning how to navigate the subway. And once you learn those things, and, you know, there's the overlay of culture, like, you know, and again, I'll bring out, you know, New York, maybe it seems like people are rude, but as you kind of get to know the culture or whatever, you understand, you know, what does this mean? What does that mean? Like if someone's like, oh no, you should really stay, you should sleep over, you should stay for a week. No, you really shouldn't sleep over. You really shouldn't stay for a week. You know, but that's just the kind of hospitality. And then as you learn all those things, then it's just like, oh, you know, it's time for me to get to work, and oh, I'm late, or oh, you know, I'm falling in love, or, you know, it's just kind of becomes life. So yeah.
Nice. So getting back to the book a little bit, what was your inspiration? Because 2009, I don't know how long did it take you to write it? Because you're writing about an election in 2009.
Yeah.
And then what inspired you to say, yes, this is a story I want to tell, a story I want to share?
Well, yeah, I started writing the book really, I mean, I'd been working on my dissertation forever. And it was kind of, you know, the moments where my dissertation would feel a little dry, or, you know, just in the back of my mind would be, oh, you know, what would I write if I could kind of just write for fun? So I really started writing once I finished my dissertation in 2013. But I would say, you know, from the beginning, you know, I mean, and I've talked about, I know we've talked about this too. I mean, just this sense of creating a portal or a way, you know, and it's like when you have like really great friends, you know, and then you bring them together at a wedding or something, and you're like, you're amazing too, you guys should talk, you know. And so for me, I mean, being able to be in Iran and having connections to the more conservative elements of society, which, you know, I mean, journalists will go to Iran, they will connect with folks, but often it's with folks that are, you know, and then they'll come back and be like, oh, Iranians are just like us. When they're in their houses, nobody wears a scarf. And that's true for a good number of folks that you might meet in Tehran. But there are also, you know, within Iran, there are all different sorts of families as well. And so having a chance to kind of connect, give American audiences a chance to get to know and even root for Iranian characters was really something that felt important to me.
Nice. Yeah, and we've had a few conversations, and we talked about books being a gateway to travel, or a portal to travel, and maybe in a country like Iran where I've never been. I appreciated that you showed not just a balanced perspective, but you showed, like you said, the more ultra-conservative side, and kind of that Sarah character is kind of just like, I just want to be a 19-year-old. I forget how old he is, pardon me, but, you know, I just kind of want to be in my late teens. I want to be a bride. And I appreciated getting that view. And I think anyone who hasn't read the book yet, it's like it's both a time capsule, because you get to go back in that time, but also you get to see communities and people you might not meet in your day-to-day life. Like you said, the reporters go back and maybe that's not who they see. So I appreciated that. I think for readers, that's, aside from being a great story, I think it's one of the benefits of your book.
Yay. I mean, I will say, you know, just kind of, you know, pushing on that point a little bit more, one of the things I was a little bit nervous about in really portraying the perspective of families that are more conservative is, you know, I didn't want this to seem like a regime apologia, you know, like that I'm kind of, you know, defending certain aspects of the regime that are absolutely not okay. You know, and it was partly important for me to have characters that defended the regime to the hilt in order for us to kind of hear the best defenses ever, and still, you know, almost to the point, you know, and then really be pushed to be like, wait, why do I think this is wrong? Oh, this is why I think this is wrong. You know, I think we often do a disservice when we set up kind of straw man, you know, it's so easy just to think, oh, everybody over there's crazy, or you know, there's no, you know, like crazy Muslims, crazy terrorists, crazy mullahs, whatever. And then when you hear the reasoning behind why people make the choices or support in the ways they do. And it's often not all that different from other people that you might know in your life, you know, in the States that are making some of those choices. And you think about, well, how do I grapple with those decisions? How do I know what's right? How do I know who to follow and where to place my faith? I think it makes it easier both to kind of, you know, humanize and understand and realize that there can be common ground, even as your lines become a little bit clear about, yes, I understand, and this is still not okay.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that's the benefit of getting to know different people. And like I said, traveling or reading a book like yours is you start gaining better perspective on just the human element. Like at the end of the day, no matter where you go, people are people, and often, like you said, they're having their rationale you might not agree with, but you can relate it to other people that we know. And speaking of these characters, I'm curious, were any of them based on people you actually know or family members, or am I allowed to ask that question?
Dangerous questions.
No, it's okay, you don't have to, but you know, I think anytime you read a book with characters that feel very alive and very real, you're like, I wonder who this could be in the author's life. So
yeah, I mean, you know, definitely composites and, you know, people, you know, that I, you know, met different pieces of them. I mean, I think, you know, the three main characters, I mean, Sarah, she's young, like you said, someone who is really excited about her wedding and what does her house look like, and, you know, and kind of just wishes all the politics would just go away. And for me, that was a really interesting and fun exploration of, you know, I want, you know, I have a teenage daughter right now. I would like for our world to be safe enough that all she has to worry about is her wedding and what her house looks like or whatever. And then, you know, at some point, and at what point does that kind of innocence that you do want to preserve and protect kind of tiptoe into complicity, where you're, you know, actively unwilling to see kind of the darker side or the uglier side, or how you may be benefiting from some of those privileges, even because of where you're at, and not wanting to rock the boat. So for me, that was kind of, you know, some of the questions that I was thinking about in the character of Sarah. And then Sadr, I think I shared with you at one point. I had the opportunity to go on the Hajj with my father. And one of the individuals that we met there, oh, and actually Holly was there too. Holly's on the call. Hi, Holly. And when we were on different groups, but we were there at the same time. But one of the men that was in our group, and he was just this leader and, you know, so kind, and served at every, you know, literally like picking up older men to, you know, move them, you know, help them, and, you know, giving his shoes to people, or, you know, making sure everyone had water, just the kindest person. And as soon as when we went into the Kaaba, you know, he was reminding everybody, don't forget to say death to America as you go around, or, you know, and it's this juxtaposition of people with such good hearts who want to do good. And then there's this piece that they're following that, you know, and the hope and my belief is that as those people, you know, kind of evolve in their lives and see, you know, these are good people who, yes, they're following something perhaps, but they're going to think about that, and they're going to question that when they're confronted with things that are really ugly about that path. So that was kind of what I was exploring with him. And then should I talk about Azar too? I'm just like on a little monologue here. Yeah. Is that okay? Okay. And then Azar for me was just, I mean, she, you know, she is kind of my hero, really, you know, someone who's really taking on the, you know, the fight for social justice. And then for her, the real question is, you know, she's someone who's burning with desire to move her country in the right direction. And she has 2 young boys. And what's the trade-off there? You know, at what point is your responsibility to being a citizen in a country? And at what point is it to be a mom? And, you know, at what point are you risking your family too much in that activism? So each of the characters gave me a real opportunity to kind of think about and, you know, some of those different things.
Yeah. No, and I really appreciated, because sometimes when you read a book, characters can be more one-sided, but you really created round-full characters, which I think is part of the reason you start going, oh, I wonder who this could really be in that person's life. Not that you answer the question, that's okay, but you know, they felt very real.
Yeah.
So to kind of get into politics, maybe just a touch. When you think about the 2009 election and you think about who was involved and then what's happening in our country, do you see parallels in our country for this election this year? Or, and if that's not a subject, that's okay, but just wondering if you wanted to reflect on that at all.
Yeah, I mean, I can say that when I first started writing the book, I would absolutely never have thought that there was a single parallel. And so it's kind of surprising to see. And I sincerely hope that the parallel ends quite soon, you know, because the scary piece, right, is what happened after that election. And, you know, I think the other piece in terms of a parallel that has been interesting, and I'm not sure US audiences would have related to it as much, is questions around protest and free speech. And, you know, what is appropriate in terms of, you know, how our commitment to free speech. At what point do we feel, you know, what is appropriate for a government to do in the name of rule of law? Because a lot of these same arguments were being made in Iran as well. And where do we stand on those issues? How do we keep people safe so that they can have a voice? So I think, you know, I mean, certainly, you know, very different issues in the US, you know, and don't want to necessarily conflate the two issues. Black Lives Matter protests, you know, each struggle is different, although I think all struggles for kind of democracy, support one and human rights are supportive of one another, but distinct. But I think those questions, there are those parallels as well.
And then kind of going back a little bit, as I was thinking about our conversation today, I wondered about the characters again. How did the characters you chose form your book? I mean, I imagine you went in wanting to tell a story and then you decided to tell it from a perspective. And so I'm curious how, like, did the characters come to you, or did you decide to choose the characters with the backgrounds you did? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, you definitely told the story from a perspective.
Yeah, and you know, I think in terms of, like, you know, sometimes people think about it as like character or plot, you know, what came first or whatever. Right. And for me, I would say it was definitely characters. Okay. You know, and I would say, you know, Sarah was the first character that kind of came to me, in part because I met young women from really religious families that were just funny and vibrant and happy, you know, and I think there's this, you know, perhaps maybe, I don't know, view of, you know, that these women in Iran, they're wearing all black and it's just so dreary and kind of scary and hard to relate to. And, you know, you have these girls that are just kind of, you know, funny and fun and, you know, and kind of frivolous and, you know, focused, you know, and so that was just interesting for me as a character. So she was the first one that came to me. And then, you know, Azar was the next one because, you know, I was really drawn to kind of stories around social justice, and then Sadr was the last one, you know, and kind of thinking about what's the other perspective that I want to have in here, and which is interesting. I mean, because I think in some ways he ends up being kind of the most transformed throughout the story. So I think his kind of perspective and character was really important to the movement of the story.
Yeah, I would say did not see his story arc coming and his transformation. I don't want to say too much more than that, but and that's a really good perspective. You're right, Sarah's. I didn't think about it, but you portrayed this woman who's, you know, raised in a very conservative religious family, and you humanized it, right? Like you said, there's kind of this it's really easy for people to just kind of look at the flat picture and make decisions and judgments, and your book definitely breaks down a lot of that and creates real people for us to relate to. So where can people purchase your book? Now that I know we're not done talking, but I think it's important to let people know where they can get your book.
Yeah, so I mean, it's available anywhere, and I really just want, you know, I love our independent bookstores. I mean, just throughout the country, wherever you are, I would encourage supporting, and our local bookstore, Books Inc., has just been wonderful. Books Inc. in Campbell, Yeah, maybe I should have, maybe I'll find the link and put it in the chat box or whatever. The other place that's local is Hicklebee's. They do more children's books, but they actually are also carrying. So if you want to go to a store and purchase, those are the best places to buy, I think.
Okay. Tell us a little bit more. I think whenever somebody says they're an author and they have a book published, people, how did you do that? So how do you, tell them a little bit about the crafting of the book itself. Like, how did you find a publisher? How did you go through that? Or if you just, you don't have to want to go through that process, but I was just
no,
thinking
it's
that
okay.
you're in Books Inc. And I was
No, I'm just saying it's a long process.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, no. It's a great question. It's a good question. Yeah, so I mean, you know, it's funny because when you first, like, now looking back, maybe it all seems like, oh, it was just meant to be. Well, I was really writing this just like feeling kind of compelled, but you just never know. I mean, the path to getting something, you know, writing the book, being able, you know, it being good enough to find an agent, then the agent shopping it around, and it being good enough to, or not, and I shouldn't even say good enough. And there's so much luck and there's so much personal taste. Can you find, you know, somebody who can relate to it in some way and has a vision for how they can sell the book or whatever. I would say starting out, you know, it was really important to me to have a few early readers who were reading, you know, pretty much every chapter. I see Holly was one of those readers. I see other people here who were early readers as well. And then once I'd kind of, and just were really encouraging. Anna Maria's here. She was an early reader. You know, so people who read the book and were kind enough to say nice things. So at least I felt like that was, you know, because it takes so long. It takes forever to write a chapter. And then finally when someone reads it, so, you know, make sure you have friends that are, or I don't know, maybe your friends will end up abandoning you because they're tired of reading it or whatever. But hopefully you have people who, you know, can give you that encouragement when it's just, you're out at sea, really. And I will say, my agent, you know, the thing that mattered a lot is she had just happened to be working with another author who had written about, I mean, and I think there's so few books that have said anything about the green wave. And she happened to be working with another author who had been writing about the green wave. So when she got my query, she got it right away in terms of understanding the story, you know, and so that's just like a total luck thing, you know. I mean, I'd sent out to about 20 agents at that point and findings, and we just ended up really connecting. But then there's the whole process. I mean, once you have an agent, there's this whole process of like, now you're sending it out to all these different publishers and hoping for that same type of thing, that someone's going to feel a connection. Maybe they've read something about the green wave, or maybe they're particularly interested in, like, you know, having stories from the Middle East, or in some way it resonates, and that then they would be interested in picking it up. One thing that's funny is just, you know, I'm so grateful for all the wonderful friends that have supported me along the way. And I think people would be like, oh, so what's going on with the book? And, you know, for years and years, it's just like, oh, you know, just this little, oh, you got an agent. Okay. It's coming out tomorrow. You know, I mean, it just seems like it's taking forever, and people are, you know, it's like, you don't quite know what to ask, and, you know, they're wanting to be supportive, and that's great, you know. But anyway, so it's really exciting that finally, after years and years and years, it's out. Yay.
Yay. That's fantastic. Yeah, I would think it's not unlike, you know, like not giving birth literally, but you've created something and you're putting it out into the world then, and then I imagine then it's waiting for feedback from not just the early readers, but just the random person who picks it up and gives a review on Amazon. So I imagine it's quite a process. And
Yeah.
well, you did a great job. I don't know if there's anything else you thought we should know before we turn it over to questions, or
let's jump into questions.
I think we can jump into questions. I'm seeing some questions pop up, so hand it over to Becky.
Oh, that was fascinating, Ehsaneh. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed having the informative presentation beforehand. And oh, what beautiful family pictures. I like was that an engagement photo with you and your husband where he was kissing you on the cheek?
Oh, yeah.
Beautiful.
That was a fun one.
We have a lot of questions here, and actually we have a few here that are all very interesting. First one is from Amelia. How long did you live in Iran, and what brought you back to the States?
Oh, that's a great question. So Okay, so when I went back to Iran as an adult, I was there about 3 years. And what brought us back in part, my husband's father ended up getting a job in the States. And so he was moving back here and I was kind of ready to move back here as well. So it was just kind of good timing. And, initially our intention was not, we kind of saw ourselves, we were really excited about building the country and being involved and, kind of following in my parents' footsteps when they had gone back. And Hamid and I kind of saw ourselves building a life in Iran. So we were just going to come to the States with his family and study. We were going to go, get our master's degrees or whatever. And then we were going to go back. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. Things, life and things in Iran, that was kind of the hot time of years that felt really joyful and like there was opportunity to do those things. And it didn't quite feel that way once we were had finished our studies. So yeah.
Interesting. Anna Maria, who I think you mentioned, maybe was one of your early readers.
Yes.
She asks, do you worry about your security going to Iran after the publishing of the book?
Yes. Yeah. So that's, we actually, once we came back to the States, we went back to Iran. At least I was every other year or so, and Hamid's family is now back in Iran. So, just also wanting to go back and stay connected with his family as well. I will say that since we haven't been there since 2016, and partly it was, the change, in the US, it just felt like things were a little strange here as well. We weren't quite sure what it would mean if we left and wanted to come back or whatever. When relations between the US and Iran are at such a low point, it also feels like, so I guess I'm saying irrespective of the book, there's a certain, you're a little more nervous when the countries aren't getting along because you worry that you could be taken as part of, the leverage or, something like that. But now that the book is out, and it'll partly, if the book just kind of dies out, like if these are, all my wonderful people who are here, if this is kind of, and then everyone's read it and then we're, then it might be just fine. Cause, but if the book kind of becomes a little bit bigger or, that also will make it feel, the problem is I can't submit a question to the Ministry of Intelligence and be like, hey, if I come, will I be safe? There's no way to really know. You just have to take your chances. And yeah, it doesn't feel, so that's one thing that's a little sad about it.
I'm sorry to hear that. Well, on a lighter note, back to the art and the craft of writing, and these were some questions that I wanted to ask too. Anna Maria also asks, when did you first think you wanted to write the book, and were you always passionate about creative writing?
So, it's funny. I don't know that I never thought of as a young person that I'm going to grow up and necessarily be a writer. I don't know. My mom's here, so I'll have to ask my mom later. Did I say that when I was a little kid? But I always wrote. I was an avid journaler. Every once in a while I'd kind of write a poem or a story. And I would say for me, it also just really came this desire, the burning desire or inspiration was around introducing and connecting and building a bridge between these two countries. And that's what drove me. And, I'll meet people and, I'm meeting more writers now who are the craft of writing and putting together beautiful sentences. And I'm just in awe and it's so beautiful. And I have much to learn in that area. And what I hope that I'm bringing is just, kind of this opportunity to have a portal into another world.
Did you ever study creative writing?
No.
But you're a natural.
Well, I don't know if I'd say that. I'm learning. It's a process.
I love what you say about your writing wanting to be a portal. Because one of the things that we always think about in the theater is that we want our storytelling to give people glimpses into other lives and other countries and other people. And so we share that goal. That's really beautiful. A couple more questions from the chat. Tahir says, when is the next book coming out?
Yes. Hi, Tahir. So yeah, so I'm working on the second book. I have one more chapter and to do, and it's like all of a sudden this, just with the first book coming out, it's like I just haven't been writing because I've just been, you know, and I need to get back to that because I want to. And I mean, it's still going to be slow. I don't have a contract for the second book yet, so as you know, once I finish it, then we're still going to be shopping it around and kind of going through some of the same process. It'll be a little faster, hopefully, because I already have my agent. Hopefully, the first book will have done well enough that that'll make it easier to get some interest in the second book more quickly. But I don't have a firm date for it. So, but thanks.
I'll be curious to hear more about it. Naveen wants to know, what part of Iranian culture do you love and appreciate most?
What part of Iranian culture do I love? Is that Humaira? I think that's my friend Humaira, who actually came and visited me when I was in Iran. So my favorite part of Iran was when Humaira came and visited me, of course. So my favorite part of it, you know, it's interesting. It's hard to say just because, you know, it's like when you're a fish in water, right? Like, you know, it's just part of you and you don't even realize kind of that this is, you know, you just speak in that way. So it's almost hard to have that outsider view. But I will say that, you know, I think what most people, you know, particularly from the West, when they come to Iran or they see Iran or, you know, interact with Iranians, they really appreciate is that hospitality. And that's definitely something, you know, I know there is a little, you know, when you go to an Iranian's home, you know, oh, come sit down, everything stops, let's have a conversation, you know, and sometimes it can be jarring. And, you know, Americans show their, you know, people show their love in many, many different ways. And it might be like, oh yeah, go help yourself, get something out of the refrigerator. That's, you know, but it can be jarring for Iranians sometimes, you know, where there's this more of like, sit down, let me serve you. So just that kind of care and attention to guests is something that I really appreciate. So I also like, you know, Iranian women just have beautiful homes and are, you know, and that's something that I admire, but I've just never quite caught up on, you know, just like fashion and, you know, I don't know that that's culture, but something that's kind of cool about them.
Well, how about food? Is there a food item that you can't get here that you miss?
We have really good Iranian stores out here. And so even like, I would say the thing that I missed the most until we got it was some of the bread. And I highly, highly recommend, so there's a particular type of bread, sangak bread, that's made on like stones, pebbles. And there is a store in San Jose. It's by the International, it's on Kurtner and Union. And it's called Honey Bakery. I highly recommend that everybody go there if they can and get some sangak bread. It's really good.
Love it. I had to ask about the food. Marina, I'm surprised you didn't. Marina is quite a cook.
I know, I was just thinking that I did not ask a food question, and I love Iranian food too. I like to try all the things. So yeah, thank you, Becky, for covering me on that one.
Oh, a bunch more questions just popped into the chat. Here we go. Let's see here. Make sure I haven't missed anything. Paula wants to know, are there other Iranian or Iranian-American or Middle Eastern authors whose books you've deeply appreciated and which you would recommend?
Yes, I would highly recommend reading Ava Homa's book. It just came out. It's a new, you know, so she's been a writer. She's written for, you know, and I think she has another collection that came out, but it's her first book of just pure fiction, you know, a novel. She is Kurdish Iranian, so she has a very different experience, and the Kurds in Iran have been oppressed, you know, for years and years. You know, so she had stories. I mean, it was new to me as well. I have not had a lot of exposure to the Kurdish Iranian experience. And I mean, it's just, it's beautiful. It's much more, it's lyrical. I mean, if you enjoy kind of just the craft of kind of writing, it's just a beautiful, beautiful book. So I highly recommend her book. Daughters of Smoke and Fire is the name.
Thank you. Anna Maria wants to know if your book has been read by a conservative Iranian. Did they hear their voice in your book, even as you're clear about your support of human rights?
That is a good question. So It has been read by conservative Iranians who, for example, were very religious and, continue to be very religious. And it has not been read, to my knowledge, by someone, and when I say religious, I mean also, generally supporters of the regime, like people who want to have a Muslim government and are comfortable with that, although they see and they are critical of some aspects of the regime. It has not been read by somebody who, for example, would say that they were like against human rights. It would be hard to find somebody who just would kind of have that, they might say, oh, Islam is the best for human rights, and this is the way, so yeah, I don't know. But for folks who are, very conservative, kind of religiously, and generally regime supporting. The thing that felt good to me is just getting the feedback that folks thought that I kind of got the feel and the story correct. Yeah.
Great. Apologies for the delay. I am making Nuruddin has asked me to make her message public. She has a bookstore recommendation. So I've just put that in the chat. Nice. I want to make sure I'm not missing anybody's questions. Another question here. Tell us of your favorite experience during writing, publishing, and publicizing process, which sounds like it went on for years and years and years.
It did go on for years and years and years. There are those kind of really exciting moments where, when I got an agent, where it just feels, because it takes a really long time. I had written the book and I didn't realize, I'd worked on my dissertation, and you get a lot of feedback in the submission process. And I knew that when you go to a publisher, you have an editor as well. So I figured, okay, I've got this, maybe it's a little rough, but you submit it. And then, and then I learned, no, it needs to be as polished, like it needs to be like perfect. So then working with additional editors, and then you're sending it out, and you're putting all this work in and not knowing if it's ever going to turn into something. So, when I got that call from my, my agent was interested in working with me, it just felt like over the moon. Actually, I was at DCS, I was at my kid's school, and it was an email actually. And I remember looking, and I was like, what is it? Could it be? So that was super exciting. And then, it's these ups and then we started working with each other, which was great, but it took a really long time to find a publisher. And so that again was, we kind of almost gotten to the point where I was thinking, well, this was great. It was my first project ever. It got me an agent. Maybe we just put this project on the shelf. I'm working on the second book. And then, this was my way to meet the agent, but the second book is the one that's actually going to sell. And we had kind of just settled on that when we found Blackstone, which has been a wonderful, wonderful publisher. So again, that was really exciting. And I will say recently, one of the things that has been really exciting was hearing from Books Inc. that sales of my book helped put it in the black after what was a really tough summer. And it feels incredible to feel like, this local institution that we know and love, this bookstore that we want to kind of survive, the difficult time of the pandemic where, bookstores are really struggling, to feel like my book had kind of a bottom line helpful impact for them felt really good. So.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
It is a terrific bookstore. Anyone else have questions? And feel free, if you want to unmute yourselves and ask one live. It doesn't have to be in the chat anymore now that we're finished with the main part of the program. Anybody want to turn off your mute button and ask a question?
I will. This is Amelia. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, Ehsaneh. I was wondering, did you ever, I'm not sure exactly the timeline of when you had children and if you were still in Iran at the time, but did you ever worry about, raising a daughter in Iran given, the restrictions on dress and behavior and that type of thing?
Yeah, so the last time we visited Iran was kind of, Martina was just on the edge of where, we would have had to start thinking about, does she have to start covering? And so we have not been back in Iran since she was really at an age where that would be a conversation. And that's a whole different thing. It was one thing for me to decide that I was going to be in Iran, and I knew kind of what the risks were. And, you know, certainly most people who, you know, a lot of young people in Iran, myself included, if you're living there at some point, you're going to have some experience with the Basijis. And it's one thing for me to have had that experience. It's one thing for me to be, you know, taken away to a undisclosed location, basically told to have my head down in the back of a car, not knowing where I'm going, and then not knowing if, you know, they're going to decide to like flog me or, you know, keep me there for a long time, or, you know, I mean, that you know, I could decide that, but to have my children in a position where something like that could happen to them, that would have been a different, more difficult decision, let alone just the question of like having to tell my daughter, you know, that she has to be covered. So, you know, yeah, I didn't end up, you know, it didn't end up being a thing, but as we talked about, would we want to raise the kids there? It was definitely something that was on my mind.
So Ehsaneh, I have a question. I asked you before.
This is my mom.
Hello, it's very late here on the East Coast.
Yes.
So the sequel, after you finish your second book, you're working on the sequel for this one?
Yeah, so that's been something that's been really fun, is hearing the number of people who are connected and excited about the book and interested in kind of hearing more about this set of characters, because my second book is not actually about this set of characters. So yes, I will have to think about that.
And we have someone with a hand raised. I'm sorry, Dragan, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Apologies. But if you would like to ask your question, feel free.
That's okay. You did great. Just a congratulations to Ehsaneh. This is great. Congratulations on the book. It's wonderful. I've read it with so much joy of learning about all the characters and everything that they're going through. I was just going to ask about when you visited Iran in your 20s, how would you sort of summarize that experience? What was going through your mind as you were getting more familiar with the environment at that time? And did you ever consider staying, or how did you feel about coming back to the US at that time? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Dragana. Yeah, so I mean, for me, I was really excited about being someplace that, you know, where it felt like there were a lot of opportunities to serve or be of service, or, you know, and I mean, really in some ways it was a little bit of, you know, privilege in the sense of, you know, me going back, I had access in ways. And I think, you know, and I don't think even as a young person, I didn't necessarily realize, just, you know, by coming from the States, I was seen as like, oh, well, she must be smart, or, oh, well, she, you know, so there were a lot of doors open to me in terms of projects that I was able to work on that were really exciting. And so as a young person, it really felt like, wow, I can have an impact here. So, you know, it felt really exciting to potentially be part of, you know, building a country or building an economy, or help, you know, working in the villages. And it was a really hard decision to you know, I mean, we wanted to come to the US. We felt like there was an opportunity to kind of study here, learn more that we could take back with us. And then, you know, life sort of went a different direction, so.
Thank you.
Mary wants to know how you learned Farsi.
Oh, so we lived in Iran when I was young, so that was kind of imprinted on me. And when I went back to Iran, I still, like, you know, I knew all the grammar. I knew, you know, so none of that was not. It didn't have to be. It's just I didn't have as much vocabulary, but my accent wasn't too bad. In fact, it was a little hard because there are not, like in the US, at least kind of on the coasts or whatever, there are quite a few people who are here, you know, immigrants that maybe have an accent. So we're kind of used to that a little bit more. In Iran, there are fewer people that, you know, have come from the US or whatever. And so there's less you know, people aren't used to, like, you know, and so my Farsi was kind of, it was not perfect, but it wasn't so bad. And so like, I feel like at the beginning in particular, people sometimes thought like, is she a little slow? You know, like what's going on? You know, like I remember one time in the Villages, like literally in front of me, one of the, you know, oh, dozarish chedir miofte, which is like, you know, like she just gets it so late, like, you know, and then I knew what she was saying. I was like, what? And she like, then they were like, oh, that's really funny. Ha ha ha. She knows what we're saying.
Oh boy.
Yeah.
We've got more questions popping up. Casey would like to know, was it difficult for your in-laws that their son chose such a Westerner, and not only a Westerner, but an American? Because you said it was a very traditional family.
Yes, it was a very traditional family. And I will say that they, it was probably not the choice that they would have made for their son, their oldest son. And they have been wonderful and great. You know, once this was a choice that it was clear that Hamid was making this choice, they were wonderful and gracious and welcoming and kind. And, you know, so I have, my beautiful, wonderful mother-in-law and father-in-law, you know, they had very different life experiences as young people, particularly my mother-in-law, and her willingness to kind of open her arms kindly to, and graciously and lovingly to someone so different is something that I really appreciate and respect and love. So yes, it was difficult, and they handled it as graciously as one could, one could hope.
Oh, that's wonderful.
Oh.
Kim says, so many congratulations. The book and its characters are haunting me in important ways. Would you speak to us a bit about geopolitics, Trump-aside, between U.S. and Iran at the present moment? Oh, interesting.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. So, I mean, I think, for folks who are following, the thing that was really scary, or we had the Iran nuclear deal that was negotiated under Obama, and it was a framework that really brought in a lot of our European allies as well, and was something that was negotiated to, I certainly don't want Iran to become a nuclear, I want as few countries to have nuclear capability as possible. So whether it's Iran or any other country in the Middle East or any other country in the world. So, and so seeing that be tossed aside is concerning from just the perspective of kind of nuclear expansion. It's also, I think, concerning for the US in the sense of alienation from allies, something that was kind of built up over time. And for Iran in particular, we have, my father-in-law, people who have illnesses right now trying to get medicine, or, the way that the sanctions have been applied back on Iran, and it's not just sanctions where the US isn't willing to do business with Iran, it's where the US is also sanctioning companies that will do business with Iran, or banks that will trade, that will allow for transfer of money. And so this is, so that's really concerning for me from a humanitarian perspective as well.
Of course, of course. I think we've got time for a couple more questions. There's one more in the chat, and if anyone else wants to jump on. Tahir wants to know, growing up, did you associate more with your American roots or Iranian roots?
That's a really good question. I think, growing up, I just felt like weird. And I think like everybody does actually, like, I don't think that's actually all that different, but, in my case, one of the things that was so lovely about my parents and a little bit unusual is that although, it's not so unusual for people of different faiths to come together and marry, but most of the people that I've met that have come from different faiths and married have put their faith aside. So it was kind of like two people who left their faith and then came together. And my parents, throughout, have been very involved with the Mormon community and the Muslim community. And so we got to go, to the masjid, we got to go to church, and we're very deeply involved in both of those communities. I remember going on like splits with the missionaries. We lived near the Mormon temple, so I played Mary in some of the nativity pageants. I got to go on the Hajj with my father. We would go to regular Doi Quamales, and as a young person, you're always sensitive about the things that feel different. Like, I'm in this community and I've got this kind of weird mom who's Mormon over here. And I'm in this community, I've got this weird dad who's Muslim over here. And, you know, even in America, just, you know, not in those communities, it feels a little weird. And then as an adult, you realize that is my superpower. Like the fact that I, you know, have this community, you know, I connect to these different communities that don't often get to connect with one another is the thing that's probably most, you know, one of the things that's most exciting to me about my life. And I think that's so true for many of us, that those things that as young people were like most, self-conscious about, or that feel kind of strange or weird or whatever, those are actually the unique things that blossom and give you a different view that as you become an adult, you're able to like share with the world. So yeah. Did I relate more to one or the other? You know, it was different at different times. I think as a teenager, I felt more drawn to the Mormon community because there was more you could do. You know, like the Muslim community just felt like way more strict, and the Mormon community felt like there was a little bit more breathing space there. As a young adult, I became really close to the Sufi community, the Muslim Sufi community, and that really spoke to me from a spiritual perspective. So I would just say at different points in my life, different aspects of the, you know, and so lucky me, I had these two religious communities. So when one felt like it was a better fit, I could kind of hang out there. And when the other felt like a better fit, I could move over.
Well, then that's a real gift that your parents gave you.
It is.
Beautiful. In the chat, Bahi says, I just want to congratulate you and say that I'm enjoying your book very much, and I feel like I know and relate to the characters from the years I lived in Iran. I was also traveling in Iran in the time of Green Revolution, and your descriptions of the time are quite realistic. Great compliment.
Yay. Thank you.
This has been just fascinating. Anybody else want to unmute and say congratulations or ask another question? Anything else?
Ehsaneh, what changes did you discover after you visited Iran within yourself?
Oh, that's a very good question. You know, I mean, I think like just having, you know, I'd grown up in the US with kind of, you know, the Iranian-American community and the Mormon community. And then it just expanded my world again, because I went to Iran, you know, which is a different community. And then within that, you know, there's you know, most of my family that is a little bit more secular in Iran, and then my work colleagues that were more, you know, religious, and then Hamid's family, which was very religiously conservative. So what it did for me was expand my worldview even more. And again, the thing that's so funny is you step into these new places, and initially it feels like, oh, this is so different. And then it just takes a little while where you're like, oh, this is not different at all. Like, you know, I mean, it's kind of like the Maman Mehri in the book, the Aunt Mehri, you know, oh yeah, there's one over here in this community. There's another one over here. Like everywhere I look, there's a matriarchy or the matriarch of the family who, you know, kind of steps up. And so I think for me, really, in terms of, it just was another dimension to kind of understand my world a little bit better and understand kind of the world as a small place, and that there's so many patterns of human behavior that are the same no matter what, how different kind of that looks externally.
You get so much out of living in different countries, don't you?
Yeah.
That's the perspective. Well, we've got one more in the chat. Anna Maria says, and this is a good one to wrap it up on, can you give us a hint about what your next book will be about?
Oh, a hint. I haven't got my tagline for my next book yet, but it's a fun one about kind of crossed love, and you know, a little bit more it deals more with a little bit more secular Iranians than the kind of really religiously conservative. And, you know, I kind of, you know, I don't know how many more books about that time I'm going to be writing. So one thing that has been really fun is just kind of throwing in a lot of really, really cool, you know, based on cool characters and cool people. Like, it's like, I want to get all these cool people that I got to meet while I was in Iran and put them in this book. So it's just that piece of it has been really fun. So. I want to, you know, I don't know if we're wrapping up. I just want to thank City Lights. I want to thank you guys so much. This has been so fun. And I just, you know, I know one of the things that was fun to hear was how many of you guys also donated to City Lights when you got your tickets for the event. You guys are doing so much to support theater and the arts in San Jose. So if folks haven't had a chance to and want to support, you know, our local theater scene, that's a really, really great way to do it.
Yeah, you'll be receiving a thank you email later on tonight, and it has a link if you were interested in donating. And I hope that some of you will like to come back on a future week. We do this every Friday night at 8, usually on Zoom, sometimes on Facebook. Next week we're on Facebook, and we've got a trio called the Francis Experience. And as I was saying at the beginning, it's hip hop and jazz and storytelling and poetry. And then on the 23rd, we have 2 of our regular costume designers coming and talking about the art of costume design. So we're just really looking to spotlight all kinds of artists on this show. And as I was saying, Ehsaneh is our first author on the show. And I was just thrilled that Amarina recommended her. This has been so interesting. Really.
Becky, one of the things that I've been excited about that you guys have been doing is also Filament, the podcast, yes, where it's an opportunity kind of, as you're going about your day, listen into like an incredible stage production. And you wouldn't think a stage production could, you know, come in and, you know, by podcast, but the way they do it is amazing, and you're just totally visualizing the scene. So I highly recommend it. It's called Filament.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm going to type the link into the chat. Our website is cltc.org, and right on the homepage, you can see information about the next stage and about the podcast Filament. The fun thing about Filament is in a couple weeks, we're releasing our next series, which is Spooky Stories, and it's all original Halloween stories and poems that are written by people in the community and read by actors from our community. I read one too. And thank you all for being with us tonight. This was really a pleasure. I'm a huge reader myself, so I was just thrilled to get an author on our show. Ehsaneh, thank you so much. Is there anything else that you'd like to say before we sign off?
Just thank you so much. This has been a wonderful, wonderful evening. It's been fun to see so many familiar faces and also exciting to see some new ones. So thank you.